It's finally time to review the entire Abomination line in World of Tanks console, and it is, of course, the mercenary tanks that Wargaming have had within the game for years now. And I guess it's a good time to actually look through some of the contracts, what tanks are the best, how they're rated, and of course we'll start off with tier 5 vehicles, because ultimately most of the tanks are kind of interesting above that tier. The lower tier vehicles you can make of what you want. But first off, let's look at the top one, the Long Bomb, and this is actually one of the tanks that I find super interesting. Effectively, it's an 82, which is the tech tree version, but this has a derp gun, and it has 64 penetration, which is pretty bad for a tier 6 vehicle or tier 5 vehicle, so you're going to struggle to pen most things with the standard rounds, but of course you can fire some of the premium rounds, which are just better in literally almost every way except from the speed. They are super slow, but nonetheless 104mm of penetration is probably more than enough to go through most tanks, and of course with 350 alpha you can really punish people with this machine. And I really do implore you guys to try and get the Long Bomb when it comes into contract. It is a superb vehicle down at tier 5 and it's a bunch of fun. It's a derp 82 that literally has super nice armor at tier 5. Then we move on to the Stubbs. Now the Stubbs is a vehicle that is similar to the 82 in the fact that it gets a little bit more alpha than the typical vehicles at this tier, but ultimately it doesn't really get much more. 0.46 accuracy makes this tank super annoying to actually hit reliably. The penetration values of both the standard and premium rounds are pretty weak as well, and so you can kind of be worth firing HE as long as you can get round behind. Remember, this is a light tank, or at least somewhat of a light tank. It kind of in between a tank destroyer and a light tank, but yeah, ultimately you want to be playing it as a light tank, and as such you actually get a decent top speed of 60 kilometers an hour, and so yeah, ultimately you don't want to be sniping in this thing, but you don't also want to be a super aggressive light tank because you'll end up getting punished really hard. Now the armor of the tank is, as you'd expect, absolutely terrible. You are going to get penned by everything and anything with this vehicle, so don't go trying anything kind of interesting in terms of armor wise. Even angling and stuff like that, people will just pen you flat out, and so yeah, an interesting one but not necessarily an amazing one. Then we move on to the Smoothman. This is like the kind of bathtub equivalent at tier 5, and this is a tank that actually at tier 5 has quite decent armor because it's very well rounded. There are some places where you get penned pretty much every time, which are on the turret cheeks, and of course on that kind of flat bar at the front of the tank by most tanks. But if you start angling and actually trying to wiggle with this vehicle, it makes it super difficult for people to actually pen you reliably if they're firing standard. But remember, this is World of Tanks console and pretty much everyone fires premium, so there's kind of that to be said for this vehicle. But a very consistent kind of main armament makes this thing pretty reliable, and so yeah, I do enjoy looking at this thing, playing this thing, and I don't necessarily discredit it when I come up against it. Then we have the Centrifuge. So if you've seen kind of this Matilda, this is kind of like a tier 5 hybrid version between kind of a Panzer IV-H turret, or at least if you've seen the Panzer V-4 turret, you know, the weak points of it are pretty awful, so you get penned by pretty much anything, and especially that big cupola. And then at tier 5, you know, the Matilda armor doesn't really work all too well, so you get penned by pretty much everything, and also the turret gets penned by everything, and then you've got, you know, fairly decent gun on this thing, but nothing too spectacular. So yeah, overall, I don't know, I don't think it's overly amazing. But then we go on to the Deadbolt. This is one that I actually have, and I actually fairly enjoy this tank. I don't think it's overly OP or anything like that, but the spaced armor on this thing can be a little bit troll. You're not going to be bouncing a whole lot because yeah, from the front you're going to be getting penned, but if you start kind of side scraping and using the spaced armor on the sides, it can work. And of course the main armament is very nice indeed, and is actually probably one of the better main armaments that we've seen in terms of the faster firing guns, so it can be worked, but I don't think it's outrageously good or broken like we see with some of the mercenary tanks in the game. And then we have the Bulwark. Now this is a tank that is fairly interesting. It has actually decent armour comparatively to the other mercenary tanks. It's also got a pea shooter, but this one has actually got decent penetration, and so you've got super fast fire rate with only having to reload for I believe like a second or so between shells. So yeah, it's like 2 seconds base, and of course that can come down, so you're probably reloading about 1.5 seconds to deal a minimal amount of damage. But it's like a kind of, it's almost like having an autoloader, but not actually having an autoloader. It's pretty nice indeed. But yeah, with the penetration values, it's not too bad, but premium is probably required for when you're in the higher tier games. But nonetheless, a really, really good tank, and I think it's probably one of the better at tier 5, but I personally would rather have the long bomb and just meme around in it. Then, moving on to tier 6, these are tanks that start to get better tier for tier than the vehicles previously. And we start off with the Plaguebringer. This is like a hybrid between a Jackson and an M4 Sherman. Kind of interesting. Gets some fairly okay armour. I think it's the M4A3E2 hull. You can actually see it in the module viewer. So M4A2E4, so it's the Easy 8 hull, so it's not particularly amazing. And then you get the Jackson turret with the 90mm. Of course, if I was going to pick a tier 8, I'd probably just go with the Hellcat. It's probably going to be much better tier for tier. But this one, not so bad, and you could definitely make it work. 240 Alpha is nice, and it's probably more of a niche tank for those of you that are interested in kind of playing the American tech tree line. But moving on, we then move to the Stinger, and the Stinger is one that I've actually really enjoyed. It is a really, really nice light tank. It is a single shot, it's not an autoloader, and this one in fact has pretty decent top speed, 65 kilometers an hour. You've got very nice the gun on this thing's pretty good for a light tank. You're also the fast, maneuverable. It's kind of a hybrid between, if you can imagine, a Chaffee and also an AMX 1375 or AMX 12T, and that's really where this thing comes into kind of comes into range. You can see the AMX 13 here, the tracks. So it's the 1375 hull. And then the M24 Chaffee turret. You got the 76mm, which is pretty consistent, and so you can rack up quite a lot of damage. And if you're into WN8 farming, this vehicle is just disgusting. So there's that too. Now, moving on, I guess we can actually go with the Spyglass since we were there. And the Spyglass is the tier 6. Now, Spyglass in its entirety is my favourite tier 6 mercenary tank, and that is because it gets an autoloader. And why does that make a difference? Well, it's the fact that the autoloading version gets, it gets 4 shots per clip. You've got 135 damage, so you've got 270, 540 total alpha damage in one singular clip, which is really, really nice for a tier 6 vehicle, and it means you can finish off people. It's 60 kilometers an hour top speed, so it's a light tank, but one of the slower light tanks, if that makes sense. It's like a very fast medium, and I mean very fast medium, but it's not necessarily that slow where you kind of have problems. You've got 6 degrees of gun depression, which is fine, but one of the key things that I want to tell you guys about is the 10 degrees of elevation, which is terrible, to be honest with you, and it is very limiting. As you probably know if you've played any of the French light tanks, the elevation can be super annoying if you're firing uphill or anything like that. So yeah, kind of one of the key things that I don't like about this vehicle, but that is about it in terms of what I don't like. It's got the AMX Chaffee kind of hull armor. It's got the 12T kind of turret, although it's not real. Well, it kind of is, but you've then got like the Type 102. I don't know whether this is a Chinese engine, not entirely sure, but you've got the 131 Model 2 kind of tracks and hull armor as well. So yeah, it's a kind of interesting tank to say the least, and I pretty much enjoy this thing a whole lot, and it is once again very, very strong for a light tank in the right hands, but for a general case you're probably not going to love it like you might love some of the other light tanks in the game. Then we have quite possibly the most broken tier 6 mercenary tank, and it is the Long Reach, and that is because this tank gets 390 alpha damage. It has really nice hit points. It's got okay vision range for a heavy tank at tier 6. It's got really good penetration. The armor model is kind of weak, but it still has more spaced armor and has probably more armor than most heavies at tier 6. So yeah, you're able to actually bounce a few rounds potentially, especially if you know how to angle and kind of use all of those characteristics that we have. Of course, I've done a video on armor and how you can use armor and what the actual values mean and how they represent in reality when you're playing in the game. So that was kind of a key thing that you might want to have a look at if you're interested in side scraping and stuff like that and learning how to bounce rounds. But ultimately, this tank is a very, very strong one. Imagine like a KV-85, but a kind of slightly faster version and one that's a bit more flexible. Albeit, you know, you have 3 degrees of gun depression, so it's not that great in terms of that. But then again, a lot of heavies at this tier and in the Soviet variants have similar sort of levels. Then we move on to tier 7 and you get the Ramrod, the Jammer, the Big Top and the Slapjack. And the Ramrod itself is a tank I really don't like. I think it's pretty weak. It's the like the M4A something hull armor, which is just flat out terrible. It's boxy, it's huge, and although yes, you may be able to go 60 kilometers an hour, it's not necessarily that fast to the point where this boxy tank is going to be able to provide all too much for you. Armor model wise, it's terrible. You'll get penned by everything and anything. There are some space armor on the sides which do help, but that's not really going to help you all too much. The main thing about this tank, however, is for a light tank, it's got 240 alpha with very, very good penetration on its premium ammunition with the 90mm that you can use on this thing. And yeah, it is kind of okay in terms of the statistics of the main armament as well. I think overall it's an okay light tank, but it certainly isn't broken or going to be dealing much damage, and that's probably why you don't see a whole lot of them in the game right now. And with the vision range of 360 meters, it's not particularly great either. Then we move on to the Jammer, and this is a vehicle that I think quite a few people like. It's a medium / light tank-esque tank. It is a medium by definition, but it is a fairly strong one if you can get over the fact that you've got 128mm of penetration. With the standard rounds, you're going to have to fire a lot of premium in this thing. Imagine like a Type 62, the light tank at tier 6, but a tier up and having slightly more armor. As you can see, a fairly decent amount of armor on the frontal hull, but you'll get penned by literally everything you meet, so I wouldn't really rely upon it. And so the turret armor is terrible as well, so you just get penned by that if people bounce off the hull armor. But overall, it's an okay, fairly solid medium tank, but I don't think it's going to be doing you any favours anytime soon. Then we have the Big Top. So imagine a M4 Sherman, but with a kind of boxy T-32 stock turret. That's basically what this vehicle is, or the pattern turret. You know, it's not particularly amazing. You've got 50 kilometers an hour top speed, but it's kind of sluggish actually getting up to that top speed. As you can see on this statistics here, power to weight ratio is okay at 18. You have okay hit points, decent detectability. It's a very much an all-rounder tank. It doesn't excel at any one thing, and it certainly doesn't excel in the armor region. It has slightly more armor on the side than typical tanks because World of Tanks Mercenaries, when they actually brought out these tanks, they just decided to take normal tanks and slap spaced armor all over them just to help them out. But yeah, overall you're not really going to be bouncing a whole lot with this vehicle, but a really, really fun one for those of you who are interested in an all-round vehicle, but it's not really going to be any of the tier 7s that you can actually get in the tech tree line. The next vehicle then is the Slapjack, and the Slapjack is, as you'd say, a hybrid of great proportion. A T29 turret with an IS hull with a basically a very nice kind of Tiger. I think it gets the 88, I believe. Yep, it does, with fairly decent accuracy, decent penetration. Not the best penetration you'll see, but it can be worked at tier 7. And overall a fairly decent solid tank, but I would much rather just play the actual T29 rather than actually trying to grind towards this. But it's an interesting mock-up of what you can imagine some of the best parts of some of the best tanks at the tier, being the IS and the T29 and the Tiger all mashed up into one and called the Slapjack. Then we have the Cruncher, the tier 8, or at least the only tier 8 on the mercenary line. Whether we'll see that change in the future, we don't know, but this is kind of it is quite a bit of a different one to your usual mercenary tank in the form that it has kind of got the, it's basically the T23E3 hull by the looks of it. And of course we can see that in the game. You can see the M26T81, which probably is in the T23E3, I don't know. It's got the Mitsubishi engine, you've got the TVP VTU concept turret, and then you've got the 8.8 centimeter from the German line, which is pretty nice. And so overall, it's a fairly accurate tank, 0.34 accuracy base, which is really nice, and that of course can be boosted with some of the perks. It can go 52 kilometers an hour. It is basically a better version of the TVP VTU, and of course gets some spaced armor on the front of the turret, which makes it a hell of a lot more difficult to actually pen, especially if you're using the gun depression, which I believe is 10 degrees, so that's really nice. And so you can basically avoid anyone being able to penetrate your turret unless they hit the mantlet of this vehicle, which is possible, but yeah, it can potentially be used on a ridgeline, but even with the spaced armor, you can still get penned through it if certain tanks actually get the part of your armor with high enough penetration. So you don't want to be sat in front of tier 10 tank destroyers that are firing AP heat rounds. That's absolutely fine because spaced armor absorbs the heat, but nonetheless, yeah, be very careful when playing this thing because sometimes you will be able to get penned. But nonetheless, a really interesting tank, and probably one of the more average / like all-rounders, much again like the big top in the game. Then it comes to the tier 9s, and both of the tier 9s are super good. The tier 9 here, the sharpshooter, has of course got a tier 10 part, because why not at tier 9 use the chieftain turret. Now, the chieftain turret does work very well. It is quite bouncy, as you probably know if you've played tier 10. You get the cupola that can be penned pretty easily by anyone that has any fingers and thumbs, and they actually know where to hit this tank. And of course the flatter section on the left hand side of the turret, when you're looking at it, you can see here it's kind of flattens off in the left, which you can pen if you've got high enough penetration. You've got the lower plate, which is a big target that you want to be aiming for, but overall this tank is actually fairly bouncy, and with the T95E2 hull it's actually very nice, which I believe is another tier 10, because yeah, why not add them all together. Then you get the 10.5 centimeter from the German line with 390 alpha and 0.3 accuracy, so it's very, very accurate as by the name, sharpshooter. And I really think that this tank is superb in the game. It is a solid tank that really can dish out a lot of damage whilst also having the opportunity to bounce, and it can go 48 kilometers an hour, much like the chieftain. It is fairly speedy to a degree for a heavy tank, so I really like it. I think it's super good, kind of trolly bouncy on the upper plate as well. So yeah, I think it's a solid tank, and I don't think anyone should ever discredit the sharpshooter. If it comes into contract, I would 100% recommend actually getting it. And then we get the most overpowered hard case, which, because, you know, spaced armor and just whacking it literally everywhere over a hull armor of a T10 that already is fairly strong, and then you add in spaced armor, the side armor of this thing, you will be better off sitting side on in the hard case than you will if you go frontally. That is literally what this tank is. It is the most idiot-proof tank I think I've ever seen in World of Tanks. The turret armor, let's just give it another IS turret and then put a load of spaced armor on, so effectively the only place you can actually hit it is in the cupolas, but good luck actually trying to hit them, especially if it's above you. Or alternatively, you've got this big spaced armor that basically hides the majority of the cupola anyway, so I mean, just have fun. Best way to tackle this tank is literally to go from the front, because yes, getting around the rear of the tank is actually worse than hitting it from the front, because wargaming, you make absolute tons of sense. And then this vehicle, it's not like it even gets a terrible gun either, because you get 0.35 accuracy, fairly decent for a heavy tank. You get 219mm of penetration, which not the best for a tier 9, but then, you know, you can always load the premium and have 330mm, because it makes absolute sense. And then, yeah, 38 kilometers an hour. It is not the fastest, I can grant it that. You got, what, 11 or 12 power to weight ratio, so maintaining the 38 kilometers an hour is not particularly very easy to do, but yeah, maybe you want to put in some of the kind of additional equipment that can boost up the horsepower, but nonetheless a very, very OP heavy tank for tier 9. And yeah, just look at it, the amount of spaced armor all slapped all over it is actually just disgusting. And yeah, overall a very, very, very strong tier 9 tank that I don't think people realize it is as strong as it is. You can pen the inner drive wheel, which is probably the only weak point from the side if you're at this angle, but if it's fully side on, you've got barely any choice at actually trying to hit it. And basically going through that amount of spaced armor on the sides, you get not just one plate, but you actually get 2 plates, well, 3 plates on the side. So yeah, good luck if this thing's side scraping to actually pen it. And yeah, it's outrageously good. Nonetheless, let's move on. The 3 tier 10s, starting off with the Tusk. This is effectively like a Sheridan with a AMX hull armor, and as such plays very much the same. It's the AMX 13105 hull armor, so it's smaller than the Sheridan. Of course, has less armor, or less bouncy armor than the Sheridan, because for some reason the Sheridan bounces Jaegerus all of the time. And then you get the turret armor of the Sheridan. You get a nice kind of top speed as well, 68 kilometers an hour. It's a fairly nippy one and relies upon the derp gun. You do not get the choice of a kind of fast firing gun. You have to wait an eternity to actually do anything in this. But yeah, a very, very good light tank if you're interested in derp. If you're not, it's a terrible light tank. So yeah, make of that what you will. Then you get the Chisel. This is the medium tank, and this is a perfect medium tank. And by perfect, I mean it has everything. It has the speed of 57 kilometers an hour. It has the vision range, 400 meters base. It has the alpha damage, 400 alpha. It also then gets the armor model that's actually pretty nice. You have the cupola, which can get penned pretty easily, but you know, most medium tanks can. You then got a ton of spaced armor on both the sides and the front, hiding that lower plate, which helps. You obviously have the upper plate, which can be penned, but it's nicely angled as well. Side armor, yeah, if people aim above the spaced armor, then they can pen, especially at the rear. But even at the rear of the tank, you've got a HE shield, which is as it is, and can stop any HE rounds actually being fired if they ever come in from the back. But yeah, overall, just a very, very solid medium tank that is outrageously good in the game, and quite possibly the best tier 10 mercenary tank out of the lot. Then moving on to one of the tanks that caused a absolute riot when it first got released. You basically take because let's give some background, this tank had the unnerfed Skoda gun, which it still does. And the unnerfed Skoda gun was basically the TVP T50-51, so it has the TVP's gun, sorry, not the Skoda T50, but it has the Czechoslovakian tier 10 gun before it was nerfed in the game, because, you know, let's give a tank that's pretty solid a unnerfed version. You then get the Chieftain turret, because, you know, the TVP with basically no turret should have the better gun, and then give it a turret, and then give it the AMX 50B hull, which is actually surprisingly bouncy, other than if people actually know the weak point, which is the inner drive wheel, which can be basically overmatched by every single tank in the game and is super easy to pen, but you have to go behind the tracks. I'm going to try and find the area where we can see it here. Should highlight it in green. You see there, this is the area where you want to fire. It's actually really nicely highlighted, actually. This is the point at which you want to be firing every single day of the week. You will pen the machine, and it's kind of its only real counter from when it's coming towards you. is go for this area, go for the tracking shot, and basically you can pin down the machine. But it will smack you in the meantime for 4 lots of 320 alpha, equating to what, like 1400 damage in total, somewhere in that region. Well, no, sorry, it's 1280 damage. So yeah, it's a pretty meaty gun that will wreck you quite easily. And with an intricate reload of 1.5 seconds and 0.35 accuracy, it pretty much hits you every single time. And don't worry, it's not slow either, because it can go 67 kilometers an hour. So dependent on the skill level that you are, and whether or not you wiggle the tank as you're going towards the opponent, can stop them hitting that weak point that we kind of highlighted, can make this tank actually supremely bouncy, whilst also being able to do 1280 damage every kind of so often. I think the reload is roughly in the region of 28 seconds, which can come down with some of the perks. Of course, you can't use advanced loader, so because it's an auto loader, but yeah, basically a heavy tank that is just better than the TVP T5051, which is a really good tank in its own right, but yeah, just a heavy armoured version that is just better pretty much in every single way. And the AMX-50B turret or hull armour is actually probably one of the most underrated hull armours within the game. It's actually super consistently good to bounce a few shells, especially if people don't know that weak point. But nonetheless, those are all of the mercenary tanks. Hopefully that's given you a good indication as to what the tanks are good, which ones you should kind of go towards first. I would highly recommend the tier 10s, being the Chisel and the Machine, then the hard case, then the Sharpshooter, then maybe the Tusk, and then go down the line as we've kind of talked about, and choose which one you think fits your playstyle. Let me know your comments in the comment section down below as to what you actually prefer out of all of the mercenary tanks, including the premiums. We'll do those in another video because there's quite a few of them, and they're kind of more interesting in terms of which ones are available and stuff like that. But hopefully this was a good guide. If you want to check out some of the tech tree guides and full reviews of the entire tech tree, then we've got a playlist on screen right here that you can have a look on the left, and on the right hand side we've got the gameplay and tank reviews, having a look at some of these tanks in action. So thank you very much for watching. Hope you enjoyed, and I'll see you in the next one. Goodbye.